Okay, well, it's 11:30 now, so I think we can start. So I'd just like to say hello and welcome everybody. My name's Barry Daniel. I'm the person who does the podcast for the Society, and it's my great pleasure and honour to be introducing Stephen Batchelor today. We've only got an hour, and I imagine most of you here are very familiar with Stephen's work, so I'm not going to give a big introduction. I'd just like to say, though, that Stephen's latest book, The Art of Solitude, is out this week, which I thought was wonderful and also extremely helpful in the unprecedented circumstances we find ourselves in at the moment. So if you'd like to get an idea what the book's about, then please check out the podcast we did together last week, which is now on the Middle Way Society webpage. Okay, so Stephen is going to talk for about 45 minutes. Then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. To prevent feedback noise, you're all on mute, but if you think of a question during the talk, just use the chat facility, then Stephen will try and respond to it at the end of the talk. And finally, the session is being recorded, so if you don't wish to be seen or heard, I can either remove you or make you anonymous when we edit the recording. Just let me know by email. Anyway, I hope that all makes sense, and without further ado, I'll now hand you over to Stephen.
Thank you very much indeed, Barry, for that introduction. And also my thanks to Robert and others who have imagined and managed to manifest this festival of the Middle Way. And even despite the current lockdown, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be able to speak with you now. My topic is about extinction, about embracing extinction, and I want to reflect on this from a middle way perspective, but particularly since my background, as many of you know, is that of a Buddhist scholar, translator, a former monk, and now someone who thinks of himself as a sort of secular Buddhist. I'll be considering this topic of extinction from largely a Buddhist perspective. And I thought, therefore, it would be useful to start just by reflecting on the Buddhist understanding of the Middle Way, or at least my understanding of the Buddhist understanding of the Middle Way. And the Middle Way, of course, is something that is announced at the very outset of the Buddha's teaching career. That is, if we are to take literally, the first discourse that he is reputed to have given was in fact the first discourse he gave. I think it's probably unlikely chronologically, but nonetheless, it opens with the very clear declaration that he has discovered a middle way. That's how the whole ball is set rolling. And in the next sentence, he then goes on to declare what this middle way is. And this middle way turns out to be what he calls the Noble Eightfold Path. And as I currently understand the elements of the Eightfold Path, I would present them as learning, as it were, to live in 8 particular spheres of our human existence and seeking to flourish in each of those spheres. And that I would take to be the practice of the Middle Way. And these spheres would be those of vision, imagination, speech, work, survival, perseverance, mindfulness, and collectedness. The Eightfold Path is also something we need to understand as the 4th of 4 tasks. And as Gautama continues in this discourse, he outlines, well, not so much outlines, he actually declares as the culmination of this discourse that his claim to be fully awake lies on his having recognized, performed, and mastered 4 tasks. And these tasks are the tasks of having embraced life, or more literally, having fully understood dukkha, or suffering, having let reactivity or craving be, having seen its stopping, which is equivalent to having come to dwell in nirvana, and having cultivated a path. And this path, of course, is the Eightfold Path. And the challenge is not simply to follow the path, but to cultivate it. But in many ways, I think we can only really understand the Eightfold Path, and by implication, the middle way, within this Buddhist framework, as seeing the middle way, the Eightfold Path, as extending through a sequence of 4 stages, as it were. The first of which is being able to embrace and understand in a non-reactive way birth and sickness and aging and death, our existential condition, and pretty much every other situation that life presents to us. The second task is to also recognize how we are reacting to the situation that confronts us at that given moment. And if that reactivity is of a nature to send us spinning into circles and cycles and repetition and indulgence and so forth, then we simply see that for what it is and just let it be. Let it go, if you like. But I think let it be is probably more useful as a term here. We're not trying to suppress anything or deny it. After all of these reactions are simply part of our natural biological responsiveness to the life as it is appearing to us. But as we let go or let be that reactivity, that enables us to begin to see the coming to a stop of that reactivity. Or if it doesn't actually stop, we recognize that by being mindful and aware of those patterns that keep repeating, that mindfulness or that awareness is non-reactive. It is already nirvanic in that sense. And it is from that nirvanic space, from that space of stillness, of emptiness, if you wish, that we are freed to then engage with life, or in particular the situation at hand, in a way that's not determined by our reactive habits and patterns, our fears, our desires, our opinions, and so forth and so on. And that is thereby the point at which the middle way is revealed. The middle way has its roots in those moments in which we experience that stillness, that clarity, that freedom that enables us to respond to life in a new way. And in this sense, the 4 tasks, seen as a totality, flesh out the middle way as a far more complex practice, one that one might summarize under the idea of care. Care is how I'm translating appamada in Pali. It's sometimes rendered as diligence or heedfulness, but I think for myself, the term care captures that maybe a bit better. So the 4 tasks can also be understood as a 4-fold task, and that 4-fold task can be seen as a way of describing, phenomenologically perhaps, what it means to care. So when we are facing a climate emergency that threatens the viability of intelligent life on Earth, this also is now the focus of our care, the focus of our practice of the middle way. And if we look at how this caring would perhaps map out, it would entail embracing the possibility of extinction, of not being paralyzed by the fear of extinction, of dwelling in a space of fearless awareness, and from there responding appropriately as one can to the threats that face ourselves and future generations. So as care, the 4 tasks can be understood as a way of negotiating one's path through life from moment to moment. And this, I think, is very much in keeping with how Robert and others have teased out the implications of the middle way as being far more than just avoiding particular dead ends or particular extremes, but actually as a way of negotiating one's life from moment to moment in our encounters with the world that impacts us through our senses, through our own mental habits, through our own thoughts, through our own feelings and emotions, and seeking to sustain a balance, a sensitivity, a perspective that is refining constantly our capacity to respond non-reactively, but from a deeper sense of what truly matters for us as our basic values, the ways that inform us how we seek to live in this world. And in that sense, once again, care, the 4-fold task, the 4 tasks, the middle way, strike me as being just different ways of looking at this broader sense of what many of us might call our practice. So one of the important points, I think, to highlight here is that nirvana is no longer considered to be the goal or the destination of the middle way or the path, but nirvana, this stopping of reactivity, of greed and hatred and so on, is the point at which the path comes into being. So the middle way emerges out of our capacity to be able to live from this non-reactive perspective. Now, to illustrate this, I would like to start with a passage that we find in the Buddhist Vinaya. And I'll just tell you this story. There's a passage in the Vinaya where the Buddha says to a group of followers who had neglected one of their number, who was suffering from sorry, let's start again. Whoever would tend to me, whoever would tend or pay attention to me, said Gautama, to a group of followers who had neglected one of their number who was suffering from dysentery, he should tend to the sick. The story here is that on arriving at this community, Gautama and Ananda had entered a lodging to find a monk lying alone on the floor in a pool of his own excrement. So they bathed and cleaned him, lifted him up and laid him on a couch. Then the Buddha went to see the other members of the community and reproached them for failing in their duty of care to one of their own. Now, this passage, which for some of you is reminiscent of Matthew 25, where Jesus says something very similar to his disciples. I think this passage brings Gautama very much into life as a person engaged with the situations he encountered in his own time. And in identifying himself with the sick monk, Gautama implies that the awakening he embodies is rooted in our capacity to care for the specific suffering of others. The episode shows this care to be spontaneous, empathetic, and heartfelt. It demonstrates how a healer would respond to the urgency of another person's suffering rather than provide an abstract diagnosis of why that person is in pain. In his discourses as well, we often find Gautama invoking the hands-on skill and practical know-how of physicians to illustrate how to practice the Dharma. So this caring that we're speaking of, this practice of these tasks, is in many ways compared to the process of healing, the process of actually engaging with suffering and addressing it in such a way that we bring some curative effect upon that person who is suffering. But to practice this kind of care does not require that we believe in rebirth or the law of karma, nor does it insist that we believe that craving is the cause of suffering and nirvana is its cessation. These beliefs actually can stand in the way of a wholehearted engagement with the ecological crisis that we face. During an interview in 1989, when asked whether a Buddhist would be concerned about environmental destruction, the Dalai Lama replied, "A Buddhist would say it doesn't matter. For even if the world were to become uninhabitable," this is me speaking, not the Dalai Lama, "for even if the world were to become uninhabitable and mass extinction is ensued, the sentient beings who perished would be reborn according to their karma in another realm, in this or some other universe." So Buddhists might well feel deep compassion for those who suffer the consequences of climate change and do their best to alleviate that suffering. But in the end, some form of consciousness will survive and be reborn. What really matters in Buddhism is to free oneself from the cycle of rebirth altogether and thereby attain the eternal peace of nirvana. By contrast, if we think of the Dharma in terms of tasks, then from the outset, the 4 tasks demand a direct engagement with life, irrespective of any a priori beliefs about the origins and end of suffering or of the nature of the self. By entering into a contemplative, empathetic, and existential relationship with the pain of the world, one seeks to respond in a way that's appropriate to the specific situation one faces. The challenge is to tackle the crisis at hand, which may be unprecedented, like climate change, and find imaginative solutions that may not have occurred to anyone before. It's unlikely that by delving into the sources of Buddhist literature, that we will come up with an answer for, let's say, climate change and the possibility of human extinction. Of course, we'll take into account the causal role in some of these crises played by psychological factors such as greed and dislike and stupidity. But the primary concern of a task-based approach is to arrive at a response based on an understanding of the full range of particular conditions, and those would be biological, social, economic, religious, and political, that underlie and contribute to the crisis. There's a traditional Buddhist meditation on death. It comes from the Tibetan schools, actually, that requires that you contemplate the certainty of your own death and the uncertainty of its time, and then dwell on the question of how, given this mortal condition, you should live now. By expanding this personal reflection to include Homo sapiens as a species, the meditation would look something like this. Extinction is certain. The time of extinction is uncertain. So how should we live now? Extinction is certain. Either the human species will evolve into a form of life that we can't now even imagine, Or if we manage to survive in a more or less humanoid form, we will be wiped out in around 1 billion years when the sun becomes too hot to sustain life on Earth. Yet neither of these scenarios is certain. A massive meteor impact, a highly virulent disease, nuclear devastation, or the repercussions of climate change could all terminate human existence at a time that we cannot predict. So just as death focuses attention on what matters most for you as an individual, extinction focuses attention on what matters most for us as a species. As a species, all that matters in the end is survival. In embracing extinction, we become intensely conscious that we are complex, thinking, feeling, sensing, caring creatures who emerged from millions of years of evolution by natural selection. For self-aware animals like you and me, to contemplate extinction can open up an astonished, quasi-religious wonder at the grandeur of being alive at all. Yet, for Buddhists, is life worth living for its own sake? This to me is a very important question, and one that in some ways has troubled me ever since my involvement with Buddhism many, many decades ago. Is the emergence and evolution of life, from a tadpole to a silverback gorilla, to be cherished as something of value in and of itself? Or is this precious human rebirth that some Buddhist traditions speak of value solely because it enables one to break free from the meaningless repetitions of samsara? In other words, from hell to heaven and back ad infinitum, and attain nirvana, where death and birth are over for good. In a recent book called This Life, the philosopher Martin Hägglund distinguishes between two forms of faith, what he calls secular faith and religious faith. And these, for him, represent two radically different conceptions of what matters most to human beings. The most fundamental form of secular faith, writes Hägglund, is the faith that life is worth living, which is intrinsic to all forms of care. To embrace such faith is, quote, to be devoted to a life that will end, to be dedicated to projects that can fail or break down. It requires recognizing that what we most care about might be lost, thereby causing us grief and pain. The religious conception of faith, according to Hägglund, is the very opposite of this. It requires that the object of faith be something that can never fail you or let you down. To have religious faith, explains Hägglund, is to disown our secular faith in a fragile form of life. Religious faith holds that our ultimate aim should be to transcend the finitude we share. So in his analysis of faith, Hägglund is led to conclude that our ecological crisis can be taken seriously only from the standpoint of secular faith. For secular faith alone, he says, can be committed to the flourishing of finite life, sustainable forms of life on earth, as an end in itself. But there's a problem here. If Hägglund is right, then how does one account for the presence of Jewish rabbis, Christian priests, and Buddhist monastics, all people of deep religious faith, at the forefront of campaigns to save the planet from ecocide. It strikes me that secular faith and religious faith are not irreconcilable opposites, but poles within a spectrum. And I think it's here that Hegel somehow parts company with the middle way approach. He tends to polarize, as is so characteristic of a lot of these kinds of analysis. He polarizes two kinds of faith. Secular faith as one thing and religious faith as another. And that easily sets up a kind of two objectified absolutes. But this does not fit at all well with a middle way approach, and nor does it actually explain very well, in fact not at all, as to how we find priests and rabbis and monks deeply and passionately concerned with the fate of the earth. So in practice, I would argue, the yearning for transcendence is quite able to coexist with a passionate love of the world. In the course of a single day, we might find ourselves shifting back and forth between these poles along this spectrum. At times of a health crisis or an ecological emergency, the nun or the monk might leave her silent meditations to heed the call of a secular faith that is rooted in her body, her emotions, and her instincts. Yet to justify this behavior in terms of her religious faith may not make much sense. We have the same thing with what we mentioned here with the Dalai Lama, is that the Buddhist worldview, the idea of freeing oneself from samsara, the idea of entering into a state of nirvana that will last forever, this is incompatible, I feel, with a passionate commitment to a love of the world. So one's outward actions as a monk or a nun going on a campaign against climate change, those actions alone do not magically absolve that person from underlying contradictions in her thinking. So if I am to take with seriousness, this kind of seriousness it really deserves, this climate crisis, then I need my thoughts and actions to be consistent with one another. I require a coherent worldview to provide a rational and ethical foundation for how I behave. Now, I'm talking to you while confined to my home in the French countryside during the coronavirus pandemic, a situation that I suspect from looking at you on the screen, we're all sharing. Outside, the streets of my village are pretty much deserted. Each time I leave the house, I must fill out a form to explain where I'm going and why. And I'm instructed also to wear a face mask. As a 67-year-old male, I am in a high-risk group. Were I infected by the virus, I could soon be dead of pneumonia or organ failure. And in fact, as I speak these very words, the invisible enemy may already be multiplying inside me. In fact, this morning I woke up with a slight sore throat, and that was precisely what I thought. I thought, oh, here we go, this is it. COVID-19, the coronavirus, is completely indifferent to the needs and desires of me and anyone else. Yet amidst all the fear, contagion, and death, I am overwhelmed by the silence around me. With the abrupt halt of economic activity, the distant background thrum of traffic and industry has ceased. Every morning, I wake up to an eternal Sunday. I hear the blackbirds sing more sweetly. It's as though nature has been able now to breathe more freely. And on paying closer attention, I notice how something has quietened down inside me as well. I realize how the vast technological apparatus that drives global capitalism had me firmly in its grip. As my teaching engagements are cancelled and the planes that flew me to them are grounded, I find that I am released from that relentless, though largely unconscious, urgency to be going somewhere, to be doing something. I'd always justified my busy schedule as a kind of altruistic commitment to serve others. But now, in this lockdown, I can see in my body how it also served to keep the wheels of the military-industrial complex in motion. The emergence and rapid spread of COVID-19 are consequences of the same kind of human behavior that is causing the heating of the biosphere. The capitalist demand for endless economic growth, the industrial scale technologies that enable such growth, the ever-increasing populations of workers packed into mega cities, the continuous expansion of globalized transport, the insatiable craving of humans to eat the flesh of other species, all of these have contributed to the ease with which this virus has infected humans and spread worldwide. One can no more blame the virus for the thousands of deaths it has caused than one can blame the carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere for the climate crisis. So this lockdown allows a breathing space to consider the tragic absurdity of much of our existence. Do we really want to be complicit in a consumerist lifestyle that drives thousands of species to extinction? Do we want to be part of an economic system that condemns millions of people to work in repetitive, meaningless jobs? Do even a fraction of the items we are daily encouraged to purchase do we need even a fraction of those things we're daily encouraged to purchase, briefly enjoy, then discard? Do we want to measure the value of our lives by the number of likes we receive on social media? Do we want to contribute to making this planet uninhabitable each time we board a long-haul airplane flight? If the answer to these questions is no, then we have to face the most challenging question of all. How are we to live together on this earth? The word virus, by the way, comes from the Latin virus, which means poison. When a virus penetrates a living cell, it transforms that cell into a factory to reproduce itself, thereby poisoning the host organism. Interestingly, Buddhism also describes greed, hatred, and stupidity as three poisons. As soon as one of these poisons gains a foothold in one's mind, it too rapidly proliferates and overwhelms one, resulting in an inner aridity, stasis, and a kind of death. So like physical viruses, these mental poisons also keep replicating themselves, keep reproducing themselves. So from Gautama's perspective, the most insidious pandemic is the one that's always been with us, but which we fail to notice. In other words, these constant ongoing habits of reactivity that drive so much of our behavior. As a physician, Gautama treats this viral reactivity by prescribing the medicine of the Dharma and by establishing a mutually supportive community of carers, the Sangha. Nirvana, the ultimate goal of Buddhism, is actually understood not as the end of existence, but as the cessation of these toxic viruses. Some years ago now, in 1988, the Thai Buddhist monk Ajahn Buddhadasa, whom some of you may have heard of, he's also well known for having advocated a Dharmic socialism, wrote an essay entitled Nirvana for Everyone. Buddhadasa's aim was to dislodge nirvana from its lofty spiritual pedestal and bring it firmly down to earth. Nirvana, he says, has become a secret that no one cares about, buried away in scriptures, to be paid occasional lip service, while no one really knows what it is. Buddhadasa insists that the cessation, even temporarily, of any reactive emotion is nirvana. Such nirvana is available to all, Buddhist and non-Buddhist alike. This nirvana is where we naturally come to rest between moments of stress and turbulence. And in this sense, this nirvana sustains life itself. Even animals, Buddhadasa claims, experience this. Such unorthodox ideas also echo Gautama's own declaration that nirvana is clearly visible, immediate, inviting, uplifting, and personally experienced by the wise. So nirvana is not some distant spiritual goal in which life and death both come to an end, as is the position of Buddhist orthodoxy. But nirvana is something that is already here right now, visible, clearly visible, immediate, inviting, uplifting, and personally experienced not just by the Buddhists, but by the wise in general. And this nirvana is the source and the origin and the heart of the middle way. So the temporary cessation of what drives the global economy, as we're experiencing here in lockdown, we could also see as a kind of nirvana. Lockdown itself becomes an opportunity to dwell in this nirvana, to cherish the still, non-reactive awareness it renders possible. By coming to rest in a space that is emptied, even briefly, of the viruses of attachment, fear, and entrenched opinion, we can glimpse the freedom to respond with care rather than merely react to the existential challenges that face us. Secular faith calls for such a secular nirvana for everyone, a naturalized and democratized nirvana, a nirvana that is not the end of suffering, but a nirvana that is the beginning of human flourishing. To respond to the unprecedented challenge of climate change might require turning Buddhism on its head in order to rethink the Dharma afresh. In exposing us to the threat of death, while granting us free time to contemplate what human life is for, the coronavirus pandemic may afford us visceral insights into a more collaborative, caring, and sane approach to living together on this earth. We might have entered the chrysalis of confinement as caterpillars, as a friend of mine recently pointed out, but might we emerge as butterflies? Secular Dharma calls for us to leave behind the consolations of metaphysics, to embrace life in all its complexity, agony, and beauty, to immunize ourselves against the viruses within our own minds, and crucially, to imagine how human communities might come to flourish in a radically changed world. It calls for the recovery of our nature as contemplative beings, open to the mystery of being here at all, and acutely aware of our inseparability from the biosphere that sustains us and all other life forms, including COVID-19. Such a perspective might lead, in the words of Martin Heidegger, to a new ground and foundation upon which we can stand and endure in a world of technology without being imperiled by it. The saving power of secular faith lies in its being grounded in our bodies, emotions, and instincts, rather than a longing for transcendence and eternity. In A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the 8th century Indian Buddhist poet and philosopher Shantideva anticipates this kind of faith in recognizing how a Buddha's compassion would necessarily entail him or her experiencing the suffering of the world. And this is the verse, this is from chapter 6, verse 126. For just as someone whose body is engulfed by fire finds no pleasure in desirable sense objects, it is impossible for the compassionate ones to be joyous when a sentient being is in pain. I've always been very struck by this verse, which is sort of hidden away at the end of chapter 6 in this book. But what it points to, I now realize, is precisely the kind of secular faith that we find in Martin Hegland. So although Buddhism maintains that a Buddha has gone beyond all suffering, Shantideva realizes that this is impossible as long as a Buddha continues to care for others. There can be no doubt, he concludes, that the compassionate ones regard all beings as themselves. So why do I not revere these Buddhas who appear in the form of ordinary creatures? That's all I have to say. As you probably picked up, I was reading some of that from a text which will appear as an essay, possibly in Tricycle magazine in August. It's much longer than what I read out, but the bits I focused on were those I felt were most pertinent to this festival of the Middle Way and to the particular experience of the lockdown that many of us are undergoing right now. I've going to invite, now we still have another 15 minutes or so to go, and I would invite you to send me any questions by the chat function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. Some have already, someone can already advise. Someone said, can Stephen sit further back from the lens? Yeah, the problem is the camera in my computer broke down and I had to get another one, which only works well for the sound if I'm close to the screen. So I'm sorry about that. This is from Julian Adkins. Hello, Julian. How does your understanding of the Middle Way help you assess your response to conditions near and far, e.g. at the political level versus the domestic and lifestyle level? How do you find a balance yourself? This is a very good question. And I think it also highlights the fact that the Middle Way is not just about, governing my own spiritual existence in the privacy of my own soul. But it has just as much to do with the issues that I've been exploring in this talk, which are far and away, which are far removed from what's going on in my mind. In the extinction that is is possible as a result of climate change and the whole crisis we now face with the coronavirus epidemic. And I've hoped, I noticed that question was posted at 12:45, 11:45, so that would have been before I got onto those topics. But that, I think, is the great challenge of this approach, is one in which we learn to find a balance between our own personal, psychological, spiritual needs on the one hand, and at the same time a response to these broader existential conditions that actually affect all of humanity, or perhaps the entirety of organic life on Earth as such. And I don't have a clear-cut answer to that question. I think it's for each of us, in a way, to negotiate that territory itself. I think
that's what I was after, Stephen. I think,
sorry?
you know, sorry, it's Julian.
Ah, hi, Julian.
So I think that's what I was after, actually, is quite a personal thing, really, in terms of how, you know, for each of us, we're faced with that dilemma. I was just wondering how you personally have been struggling with that, and you know, what's unfolded for you.
Well, okay. When last year, many of my friends, my Buddhist fellow teachers and others, became very involved in the Extinction rebellion movement in London primarily, and elsewhere in Europe as well. And I realized that I didn't have within me the urgency and the drive to go out and join them. And this led me to ask why, because I came to deeply admire the sacrifices and the real challenges that many of my friends had faced. Some of them got arrested, some of them have now got criminal records for things like aggravated trespass and other such criminal activities. And this really made me think, how am I responding to this issue? And I realized that I was taking a back seat, by and large. I wasn't really engaging. I agreed with all of their broad ideas and principles and so on. But what was I actually doing to make a difference in my own life? And I realized that I had to consider where my strengths and my skills lay. And I feel that they lie primarily as my work as a teacher and as a writer. And this then led me, for the first time, in fact, to write an essay on the whole climate emergency. And that's what I've been reading from, in fact, this essay on embracing extinction, which I call Embracing Extinction, stimulated in many ways by an essay by Catherine Ingram called Facing Extinction. I don't know if any of you have read that, it's very good. So I actually sat down and started to try to respond to these larger issues as a human being, as an inhabitant of this planet, and as someone who espouses a lot of the values that I also hold very dearly to heart. Halfway through writing the essay, I then went off to India and I led a pilgrimage through Buddhist cave temples and so on. Then I went off to America and selflessly promoted my book for a month. And then I came back into France just as all this was coming down at the beginning of March, middle of March. And I found myself in lockdown. And then when I looked at the essay again, climate change, and so it all seemed a little bit old hat. Another issue had come very vividly into our experience, which is that of the coronavirus. So I've been spending much of this lockdown trying to think through how these two issues are connected, or if they are connected. And that too is what I've been sharing with you today. The last passages I read were things I was writing last week. So I'm actually giving you a blow-by-blow account of how I am trying to deal with these things on a personal level. I'm showing you this rather than trying to rationalize what I'm doing. And that's, I think, the best possible answer that I can give you, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's a work in progress.
I found it very helpful this morning, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, very much. There's a question here from Robert. Would embodied faith or confidence be equally good labels for what you are calling secular faith? does the secular label not raise a danger of anti-religious polarization? Well, yes, it does. And that's probably after you posted that question, Robert, that's exactly what we came up with. And this, I begin to realize more and more, is a danger in using words like secular, because we immediately set up a polarization. But I think there are times in the history of pretty much any tradition where if we feel that the tradition is going too far towards one extreme or one absolutization, and I see Buddhism as having for many centuries really, having veered increasingly towards a kind of religious doctrine and dogma and belief, notions of metaphysics about transcendent nirvana, and so forth and so on. I feel that there are moments in the history of traditions where we need to call attention to what we feel to be a veering off the middle way. And we can do that effectively by setting up a counterpole. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why I've been drawn to this notion of secular. Secular Buddhism, secular Dharma, secular faith, is precisely to raise the flag that, hey, we might be losing something here. We might have lost the middle way by having gone off the deep end into religiosity. And I also find it problematic that engaged Buddhists, or people who identify themselves as engaged Buddhists, often think that all we require is taking good, orthodox, old-fashioned Buddhism and sort of pumping up a bit of compassion and loving kindness and bodhicitta, and then it'll all be fine. But the very notion of the very notion engaged Buddhism is problematic, because it implies that engagement is just an option. You can be a Buddhist, but you can also, if you want, be an engaged Buddhist. I find that very unsatisfactory. And this has led me more and more to come back to rethinking at root some of the fundamental Buddhist dogmas. And the primary dogma that I take issue with is that of the Four Noble Truths. And I pretty much abandoned the Four Noble Truths. And in that sense, I'm perhaps not, in many Buddhists' eyes, a Buddhist anymore. Instead, though, I have sought to go back to the source idea of thinking in terms of a fourfold task, or four tasks that I outlined at the beginning, which I feel is a very good way of elaborating and teasing out the implications of the middle way. And I've come to consider that as a form of secular Dharma, of secular Buddhism. But I fully agree that that too could become another dead end. That too could become another absolute thing that we get attached to and hung up in, and then we get very negative about religious people who hold beliefs that we find are unholdable. So again, if we're talking of a path, a way, we're talking of a process that's continuously unfolding and continuously having to negotiate these tendencies to slipping into absolutes. So I fully take that criticism to heart, and hopefully we might arrive one day at a point where those sorts of polarities are no longer an issue for us. We may be simply able to recover a sense of what the Dharma means for us as practitioners in this day and age, and we no longer need to pursue the argument of engaged Buddhism or non-engaged Buddhism or religious Buddhism or secular Buddhism. We can drop all that. But as a
Stephen.
Yes?
Sure.
Robert, yeah.
Yeah. Just in terms of the language we use, I mean, I do think I appreciate what you've tried to do with the word secular, which I think is inevitably what you have to do really when you try and talk about the middle way, is you have to kind of recruit or appropriate language which might be associated by a lot of people with one side or another and try and use it to represent the middle way. But I guess I'm always concerned with the practical effects of doing that. And so if you're using secular in your particular sense, I mean, I know it's not just your sense, it does have other precedents. But if you use it to try and represent the middle way, do you have another word you would use to mean absolutized against religious traditions?
Your voice was breaking up as you were speaking, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
Do I have another?
Yeah, so do we have the language we need, basically? So if secular means middle way, do we have another word we can use to mean anti-religious?
I don't know. I've not really thought of that. I can't think of one offhand, to be honest. But I wouldn't. Let's take the example of Ajahn Buddhadasa, who I quote at the end of this article. Now, he, I think, would stand as a very good example of a secular Buddhist, but he doesn't use the word secular at all. That's completely outside his scope, but he's nonetheless saying a lot of the same things. And I, to my shame, actually, I only recently discovered this essay on nirvana for everyone. It could almost be a core text of secular Buddhism. It's marvelous. And then his philosophy, his political ideas as well, extraordinary. Another figure too in this regard is Bimra Ambedkar. I think he too stands as an incredibly good example of a secular Buddhism. And he's doing something very similar, but in a very different context, of course, and in a very different way. But to me, what really matters is maintaining, in my case, the Buddhist tradition as a living tradition. And a living tradition is one that is constantly in a kind of dialogue with its own past. A living tradition is one that's constantly seeking to find the middle way, if you wish, within the context that we currently live. And certain terminology might be helpful at certain times, but as I mentioned here, I think we need to find space both for the secular and the religious in our lives. And I think it's very helpful to not think of these as polarized opposites, but really different dimensions within the deeper context of human experience. I'd like to move on from this. This is because we're running out of time. This is from Robin. Following from Robert's questions, do you find the term Dharma practitioner more useful than Buddhist? It's something I've been considering for myself in how I describe myself to myself. I want to label if I want to label my practice at all. Yes, I find it increasingly difficult actually to self-identify as Buddhist, because as soon as I do, I get drawn into discussions and conversations that I really don't find very interesting. About, do you believe in rebirth? Do you believe in karma? Do you this, that, and the other? And unfortunately, however, whether I like it or not, Buddhism is a world religion, and Buddhism has a history and a very rich culture in which these ideas have got fairly stabilized meanings. If I don't accept many of them, like if I don't accept the Four Noble Truths, the rebirth, this sort of cosmogonic theory of karma and so on, why do I keep calling myself a Buddhist? I'm not sure I'm happy with that anymore. And like you, I would consider myself a practitioner of the Dharma. And I would even go so far as to say that Buddhism can actually get in the way of practicing the Dharma. That it sets up certain kind of images, certain pictures, certain beliefs, certain assumptions that I feel actually go against what I discern to be the principles of the Dharma that we find in some of these earliest texts. So yeah, I call myself a practitioner of the Dharma. I also don't teach secular Buddhism anymore. I teach secular Dharma, precisely to somehow let go of the Buddhism and all of its associations. This is from Peter Williams. Would you in line with middle way thinking agree that an all or nothing nirvana is inconceivable and a gradualist experience of degree, not absolute, is what humans can and do pass through at times? Yes. I think the idea of thinking of nirvana as some kind of final state, some absolute state, some transcendent condition, I don't find helpful at all. And the passage that I cited in my talk, where we find Gautama saying that nirvana is clearly visible, he says this of the Dharma too, more commonly. Nirvana is clearly visible, immediate, inviting, uplifting. This shows very, very transparently that nirvana is a possibility that is open and available to us in each moment. And it is a condition of freedom, maybe very brief, but it's in those moments of freedom that we have the capacity to respond to the situations in life rather than merely react to them. So nirvana therefore becomes, in a way, the fount of the middle way itself, the origin of the middle way. And we're going in and out of it all the time. Read Buddha Dasa's little booklet, Nirvana for Everyone. You can get it online, just type it in. Oh, okay, is it possible to get a link to the essay of Nirvana? Well, I've just given you that. Oh, someone has actually just gone and posted it. Thank you, Gary. Victoria, you referenced another Buddhist teacher after you said that Ajahn Buddha Dasa's essay was a good example. I didn't catch the name. That's Shantideva. Shantideva, Shantideva. Shantideva has been a light of inspiration to me throughout my Buddhist career. I translated his book from Tibetan many, many years ago, and I continue to be surprised and inspired and enlightened by Shantideva. There's also stuff in Shantideva I don't like much. It's kind of misogynistic in some passages, but broadly speaking, I feel Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the Bodhicharya Avatara, is an extraordinarily powerful text. So that's Shantideva. Oh yes, could I give the name of the other secular teacher other than Buddha Dasa? That's Bhimrao Ambedkar, Ambedkar. He was the first Minister of Justice, I think, in Nehru's government in 1948 in India. He then went on to host the committee, chair the committee that wrote the Indian Constitution, which is an avowedly secular constitution. And then he converted to Buddhism in order to free his people from the curse of untouchability into which he was born, and has set in motion a movement that continues to this day to grow and is having enormous political and social impact in India right now. Would you, this is from Blue Harpo, and this is going to have to be the last question. Would you agree with something I always remember a Buddhist teacher saying, if you call yourself a Buddhist, you are suffering from an attachment? Not necessarily, I don't think. I think I can see the point of that, but I don't think it's, I think it's going a little bit too far. I think you can call yourself a Buddhist for all manner of reasons, with and without attachment, to be frank. I wouldn't say that. I do think, though, as soon as anyone adopts any self-identity as an X or a Y or a Z, then they set up the condition to become attached to something. That, yes. But just to use the language, no. I think I'm going to have to conclude here, if that's okay. I hope what I have said has been of help to you in this festival. And I wish you all very well in your lockdown, wherever you happen to be. And I also look forward perhaps to meeting some of you tomorrow at the same time, same place, at the Middle Way Festival, where I'm going to be part of an arts symposium.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm sure that was really interesting and thought-provoking for everybody. Just to say, if, there was a few questions as not answered there. If you want to carry on the conversation, just go to the forum on the Middle Way Society site and find carry on the discussion if you'd like to. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.